Well, we will start now in Chapter 11 on the peripheral nervous system. So we looked at the brain, the parts of the brain, and then we looked at the spinal cord. Now we're looking at the peripheral system. You'll see peripheral nervous system. You'll see a gap in the slides. That is a section for the cranial nerves, and I've got a separate video for those. So when we look at the peripheral nervous system, what's happening here are all the things that are coming off the brain and spinal cord. The ones coming off the brain are called cranial nerves. Again, we've got a special set apart video for that. There are 12 cranial nerves. And then the ones coming off the spinal cord are called spinal nerves. So remember, the CNS is the brain and spinal cord. We're looking at the PNS, peripheral nervous system, which are the extensions off of the brain and spinal cord. Now, the peripheral nervous system is divided into two sections. One of them is called somatic nervous system. A big key in here is this word soma. We're going to look, soma in general means body, but when we're talking about the nervous system, it means things we are aware of. It's conscious activities. So the somatic nervous system, there are both cranial and spinal nerves that connect the central nervous system to the skin and skeletal muscles. There's only a few things that we actually have control over and can actually feel. The skin and the skeletal muscles are basically the two things that we have conscious control over. And so they make up what's called the somatic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, I like to call it the automatic pilot. So the autonomic, it's called, autonomic nervous system, are the cranial and spinal nerves that connect the central nervous system to the organs, the viscera. This is all subconscious. That's why I like to refer to it as the automatic pilot. It's the subconscious, the stuff that is controlling your body underneath your conscious effort. And it is the largest percentage of the nervous system. So again, just a little picture here showing how it's divided up, and this actually divides the cranial nerves into the somatic and autonomic, and the spinal nerves into the somatic and then the autonomic. So one of the things about the peripheral nervous system, and you'll notice this, hopefully this should look very similar to something you saw in the muscular system. All right, so we're looking at an actual nerve here. This a nerve extending off of the spinal cord. This is a spinal nerve. So this is called a nerve, and all it is bundles of axons. So these are little connections, telephone cables that are running through here, right? And so they're organized. And again, they're organized pretty much exactly like the muscles. So we have, endoneurium, perineurium, and epineurium. We looked at them in the muscles as endomyosin, perimyosin, and epimyosin. Remember, epi means outer, and you should be able to remember endo means inner. So what happens is this nerve has an outer covering, and it is called the epimyosin. Now, the epimyosin is around the outside, so if I cut this and look at it, you will see all of these little things called fascicles, just like we looked at with the muscles. So I got these little bundles called fascicles. Now the fascicles are surrounded and separated from each other by perimyosin. Perimyosin is what surrounds the fascicle. It would be on the outside of this part right here and separates the fascicles from each other. So if we look at the fascicle and cut it in half, you'll see that there's all of these little individual tubes in there, and each individual tube is an axon. And so each individual axon is covered by endomyosin. So endomyosin wraps around these to protect them from each other in the fascicle. The fascicle has perineurium. I think I said myosin a minute ago. I apologize. Perineurium. The perineurium separates fascicle from fascicle. And then finally we have epineurium, which is the outer coating. Now, nerves and nerve fibers are classified into three basic types. There's two that are the main ones. These are peripheral nervous, basically. Sensory nerves and motor nerves. All right. Again, sensory nerves take information into the CNS, and motor takes it away. All right. Now, all spinal nerves are what are referred to as mixed nerves. See, mixed nerves are going to have information going to the central nervous system in it and coming away from the central nervous system. That is a mixed nerve. All spinal nerves, all nerves that are coming off the spinal cord are called mixed nerves. Don't even worry about this except the first pair. That's not a big deal. So the cranial nerves can have some nerves that are dedicated to sensory only. So your eye, for instance, you're sitting here and you're looking, stuff's going in. There's a nerve that's leaving here going into the brain, and it's only sensory. Information is coming in from the eye. There is no motor information coming from the brain back to the eye. So it is sensory only. There's some other ones, again, some of the muscles that move the eye. They are motor only. There's only information going to it. There's no information going away from it. All right, so I hope that makes sense. When we look at the cranial nerves, these two will become kind of important because you'll learn, we'll have to figure out which ones are which. Most of the cranial nerves are still mixed nerves like normal, but there's a few that are dedicated either sensory or motor. But again, all spinal nerves are mixed nerves. Now this is where we start getting into some weird word salad type stuff. This isn't that difficult. However, it can get confusing. Look, there's two sets of two words that you need to know. Somatic is one word, and its counterpart is visceral. All right, you need to know what those mean. The other one, and I'll use A and B on this, there is efferent and afferent. Right? So there's only two sets of words that you need to know, and each set has two words, and they are opposite from each other. So somatic, we just learned, means conscious. It means things we are aware of. It also means skin and muscle. Visceral, hopefully you know that means viscera, but it really means unconscious. It means things we're not aware of. And again, it's going to things, or it's got to deal with things that we don't have conscious control over. Now the other two, this A and B, these are the direction. Efferent, we said, was a motor impulse. It was leaving the CNS. So if I have the CNS here, I have sensory or afferent coming into it, and then I have motor or efferent leaving it. All right, trying to do my best to get some of these letters out there. All right, so all we have to do now is understand the words, and we can figure out what the statement is. So if I have general, which you see all of them are general, right? General, somatic, consciously aware of, efferent or motor fibers. These are going to be motor fibers going to the things that I am aware of. So the things that I can move and consciously move, the only thing we have in our body that we can truly consciously move are skeletal muscles. So general somatic efferent fibers are going to skeletal muscles. So if I go to general visceral, so this is unconscious, subconscious, this is generally organs, viscera, efferent, right, motor. So this is going from the CNS to smooth muscles, also cardiac muscles, and glands, things that we don't control consciously. Right? So there are two types of motor impulses. The one motor impulse is going to things that we can control, so it's called somatic efferent. The other motor impulse is going to things that we do not consciously control, and so it's called visceral efferent or efferent. So then we go to the afferent, which means this is sensory. So the somatic afferent, things we're aware of that are coming in from our body, they are sensory impulses that are going to the central nervous system from the two things that we can feel, skin and skeletal muscles. So if we go to the visceral afferent, right, visceral sensory, unconscious sensory, it is sensory impulses to the central nervous system, again, to the central nervous system, because that's what afferent is doing, from blood vessels, which you do not think about, and internal organs. Again, none of us are going through going, man, I just ate a big breakfast and I had a lot of carbs in it, so I got to make sure that I have, these certain, different enzymes that I'm producing. I don't think anybody in here has ever thought, man, I need more pancreatic amylase, right? So, those are things we don't think about. So, general just is saying that these are the general things. We're going to look at the special ones next. But again, don't get overwhelmed with these terms. It's really pretty straightforward. Somatic is things we have conscious control over or can feel, and there's only two things: skeletal muscle and skin. And you can't move skin. The only one that you can move or motor is skeletal muscles. Visceral means that it is coming from my organs, things I don't have conscious control over. And if it is efferent, which means it's motor, it means it's going out to a smooth muscle. Peristalsis in your GI tract as it's moving it through. You're not controlling that. The visceral afferent, it's coming in, so it's from blood vessels or internal organs. There's a lot of reflexes that are going to happen, especially like for your GI tract. As things are moving along, there's going to be a sensation that comes into your central nervous system telling your body where that food substance is along that tract, and it's, controls the organs accordingly. Now, this is the one that is a little bit weird. All right, so this is special. That's why it's weird. Special is special. These are pretty much only, I shouldn't say pretty much, these are only cranial nerves. These are very odd. And you'll see that there's only one efferent, right? So there's only one motor, right? And remember, efferent is motor. And so there's only one motor, and it is something that we can control. These are chewing, swallowing, speaking, and facial expressions. Now, again, this isn't something that you think about. Again, the only place that we can control the skin is in the face, the facial expressions. That's why it is special. Speaking is a very special thing. We kind of take it for granted, and some people shouldn't, not necessarily take it for granted. Some people use it too much, but anyway, speaking is a very special thing, and so we're causing something to move, so it is motor, and we have conscious control over it, although some people don't consciously control what they say. You can kind of remember that. If that's a good way to remember it, I don't know. To me, it would be. So we have two afferent, two things that are sensory. We have both the visceral and somatic sensory. So we have special senses that are from the viscera coming in, and these are things that we don't necessarily have control over: olfactory and taste receptors. Now, I can't go into exactly why all these things are. It is a very complicated process, but I think all of us should know that your sense of smell and your sense of taste are completely tied together. If you have a head cold and your nose is stopped up, everything's going to taste bland. If you put something on your nose and stop your sense of smell, you'd have a very hard time telling the difference between an onion and an apple, actually. So just to let you know, there's a lot of they're tied together. So if you can remember that they are visceral, that would help. But they're tied together, and you should know that they're both sensory. Now, the somatic sensory groups another two, basically three: sight and your hearing, as well as equilibrium. Now, hearing and equilibrium kind of go in the same thing, vestibulocochlear nerve, which I think you looked at in lab. Anyway, it's your sense of hearing and balance. Your sight and hearing are also tied together, and they are somatic. which means that you have control over what you listen to and what you hear. Now, again, I'm not going to get too far down this. I mean, you have control over what you taste, but you don't have control over how it tastes necessarily. But you can control of what you look at and what you hear. And that's one way to remember that it is a somatic afferent. Now, again, this is just something I will say, there's more to it than just that, but you can see the two that are tied together. Your smell and taste, sight and hearing. If you can just remember that most people don't take conscious control over what they watch and what they listen to, and so it drives them to different areas, you can kind of remember it's somatic. I don't know. That's the way I look at it. So now we look at the spinal nerves and how they're organized. Now remember, all of them are mixed nerves. Now it says except the first pair. We're going to kind of leave that alone. The first pair is motor, but right now I want to keep it fairly straightforward. You can adapt it as you get farther along. Most of you probably are not going to be a neurologist, but if you are, man, I'm excited for you, but because I think it's amazing. But anyway, that's when you'll start worrying about that. As for me, I'm going to make it to where all are mixed nerves. Now, they come off the spinal cord, and there are 31 pair of nerves. Now, if you did the math, you've got 7 cervical vertebrae, can't spell everything out, 12 thoracic, and you got 5 lumbar. All right. So that's 24. And if you can remember that there are 5 sacral and there are 1 coccygeal, that equals 30 bones. So what it's saying is, I'm just going to draw a couple of them. Man, wow, that's terrible. So let's say I have 4 vertebrae here, and I have a pair of nerves that come off above, a pair of nerves that come off between this one, this one, this one, and this one. Because I start and end with a nerve, I'm going to have one more nerve than I have bones. And hopefully that makes sense, right? So I start and end with a nerve. And so since I have 30 bones, I got thrown off there, sorry. Since I have 30 bones and I start and end with a nerve, I have one more nerve than I have bones. So I have 31 spinal nerves. And somewhere along the way, one of those sections will have to absorb the number because they're numbered for the bones associated with it. So it's in the cervical spine that we absorb the 1. So in the cervical spine, I start with a nerve, and then it goes through 1, 2, 3, all the way down to 7. And then so I've got these nerves that come off between them, and then underneath 7, I have the last one. So then I get down to the thoracic spine, and from then on, from the thoracic spine down, the nerve is named for the bone above it. So the T1 spinal nerve comes out underneath the first thoracic vertebrae. Now, the C1, so the cervical spine's different because it has that extra, it absorbed that extra nerve. So C1 is above atlas. C1 is above C1. The nerve C2 is above C2, or axis, all the way down. And so there is this one nerve called C8 that doesn't have an 8th cervical vertebrae associated with it. But that's because, again, we have one more cranial nerve that's in the cervical spine than the bones. And again, that's the best way I can describe it. I hope that makes sense. That thing that we looked at before in one of the other videos, the cauda equina, is these are where all of the roots of these lumbar sacral and coccygeal nerves come out. They extend off of the conus medullaris, remember, and they come out and they make this thing that looks like a horse's tail. So they call it cauda equina. tail of the horse. Now, when a spinal nerve comes into the vertebral column, so in here it's kind of light, but I'm going to highlight, this is where there's a little space in the vertebrae here. Right, so this is where it's been cut across. There's a little hole, so if I'm looking at the vertebrae to the side, it would be kind of like this, and then the other one below it would have something like this, and they'd have a little joint there to kind of come together. So this little hole represents a hole in the vertebral column. When the nerve enters, and remember, this nerve has motor impulses and sensory impulses. It is a mixed nerve. So as it enters into this little area right here that we'll just say is that little hole here, it will divide. The anterior branch is bringing information. Oh, I got that one wrong. I almost messed up there. The posterior branch, I was looking at this backwards. The posterior branch has information that is coming in. Now, the posterior branch is sometimes called the posterior root or dorsal root. Remember, posterior and dorsal are always, they're synonymous. They can be interchanged. That nerve goes in, and then when something needs to go out, it comes out on the anterior or ventral root. And so these are what we refer to as nerve roots. Nerve roots. You have a posterior or dorsal and a ventral or anterior nerve root, and that's the way the spinal nerve branches. Now, on the posterior or dorsal root, there is a swelling. Anywhere there is a swelling in the peripheral nervous system, like on this, if you can read it down here, a swelling is called a ganglion. A ganglion is where cell bodies are going to be found. And so as the dorsal nerve root comes in, there's this little bulge right here. And if you remember, and this is from the last chapter, I've got this nerve that comes through here, and it is sensory only nerve, and it's the normal one, and it is going to be a unipolar nerve. So this is where all the cell bodies for those unipolar sensory neurons are found. Right? And that's what the dorsal nerve root is, or a ganglion is. Now here's one of the interesting things. So we've got all these spinal nerves coming out, and as they go out to the skin, they make a pattern, and it's called a dermatome. Derma means skin, tome means layer. So we've got all of these little individual layers, and so this is what, and I'll look at this one, C6 right here. When I was in chiropractic, I would have people that would come in with car accidents, and they'd have whiplash, and it was real common. And I'll use this the left arm here. There's 3 main dermatomes that go into the hand, and so all 3 are ones that are commonly injured in whiplash cases. So I'd have people that would come in and say, I don't know, but I've got pain and tingling in my thumb. And so I would know they probably have some problems at the level of C6. Or they would come in and say, man, my pinky, it's always cold. My pinky and my ring finger up to my wrist, they're always cold. That's C8. So I know I can start looking at that area to find if there's something wrong. And so that's what dermatomes are. We're going to find out that the dermatomes that are kind of brown right here are going to be things that we're going to call plexuses. And even in the low back, even down through here, these are going to make up things called plexuses. And it's a very complicated thing. We're only briefly going to talk about it. But hopefully that makes sense. Dermatome charts are really good. If you've ever known anyone that had shingles, a lot of times it's going to make these little bands in the rib cage around where the ribs are, and it's because the nerves there, because that's what it's affecting, are going to run on distinct dermatomes. The rash you see is going to be a dermatome layer. So now the ventral root, right, the one that is coming out, that is motor again, or I could say efferent. These are going to have cell bodies that are in the spinal cord, and as it comes out, all right, it's going to come out on the nerve root, on the anterior or ventral side. It's going to pass through, and then it will join in and form, again, the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve is going to have afferent and efferent information in it. Now, it is going to branch a lot as it comes out because it's controlling, it's sending signals to everything. So one of the branches, and you can't really see it here. I'm trying to look to see if they even have it labeled, and I don't think they do. But one of the branches is going to come out and go back and affect the meninges. That is called the meningeal branch. I'm going to have one that goes to the back, and it's going to be a pretty small one because, again, the spinal cord is pretty far posterior, so the only thing it's really going to is it's going to basically be the muscles that are along the spine along the spinous process. The anterior branch is the one that's going to come out and go around, and these are the ones that are going to be on distinct dermatomes pretty much. That's the anterior branch. And then we have this special one that we're really going to look at. It's only found in the thoracic and lumbar area, and it is going to be going to the viscera. It is called the visceral branch. All right. So a nerve plexus, this is when several nerves will intertwine back and forth. They'll join with another spinal nerve that's close to them for a brief period of time, and then they'll separate. So when they separate, each one of those has a little bit of the two original ones, and then they'll join with other ones. And so it'll keep intertwining the nerves that are going out to help make sure that if there's damage to any one nerve root, that we are not going to have a problem with paralysis. So, as it says here, complex network formed by the anterior branches of the spinal nerves. There's only going to be there's only really two areas where this is, or I said another way, there's one area that it's not. The thoracic spine does not have plexuses. They just go through the intercostal spaces, and they're called intercostal nerves. Those are the ones we looked at, or I pointed out to just a minute ago with shingles. Now, there are three. Cervical, hopefully you know where that is. Brachial, you should understand brachial means upper arm, basically. So you should have an idea where that one goes. And then lumbosacral, you should have an idea where to look for those. Now, what I'm going to do, so the cervical plexus, I'm going to kind of skip through to see a picture of it, but the cervical plexus is going to have the first four nerves that are coming out of the spine, C1 through C4. And they're going to join for a minute and then split, and then these are going to join, and then they split, and then this one joins this one, and this one, and this one, and then this splits, and this splits. So it makes sure that it's all shared. A big thing about this, C3, C4, and C5 contribute to the phrenic nerve, or phrenic nerves, because it's more than just one. And this is what controls the diaphragm. So if you have a neck injury around that area, you can end up having some big problem, with breathing. And you've seen people, if you've ever seen someone have to get a tracheotomy, that's what's going on. So this is a picture here. There's a better picture coming up. This is where the plexuses are. So the cervical plexus is 1 through 4. Brachial plexus is the only one that has some of the thoracic spine in it. The brachial plexus is C5 through T1. And then the lumbosacral is going to have lumbar all the way through sacrum. So that's I want you to know the three different types and an idea of where they are. And it should be relatively easy. There's only one that has any lumbar, lumbosacral one. The cervical are all cervical vertebrae. The only one that has a thoracic is the brachial, and it's going into the upper part of the arm. Now again, I'm not going to ask you about this, but these kind of show, I should have enlarged this a little bit more. You do not have to know these. Repeat, you do not have to know these. When you get into the the nursing program, or if you start doing tests, you might have to get into these, and this is a good place to see where they are if you remember what this stuff is. These are important nerves, but these are not nerves I'm going to require you to know. All I wanted to point out is you can see this is the brachial plexus, C5, C6, C7, C8, and how they will join and kind of go through different junctions, separations, and junctions. I always joke, I grew up in Mississippi, so I can say this. I always say it's kind of like a Mississippi family tree, a lot of intertwining. I just like to try and joke about that, but hopefully it helps you see it. But that's what's going on. And you see what happens is if I have paralysis, let's say of this C6, so something happens and this C6 nerve is damaged and it's no longer sending any signals, I am still going to have C5 and C7 that are going to help it. Even C8 and T1 will join and help it. That's why I can have a complete injury of one of these individuals, and while it's going to affect the function and it's going to affect the sensation, like I said, it'll have numbness and tingling, it won't be paralyzed. And that's the point of the plexuses. Again, not worried about these. This has some pretty important ones. Again, if you're out in the real world, the sciatic nerve is something that is one that is good to know.